They say justice is blind, but in Department 4, it was deaf, dumb, and incredibly arrogant. When Deputy Carter Bennett saw a black man in a tailored suit standing near the judge's bench, he didn't see a man of the law. He saw a target. He laughed, he mocked, and he clicked the handcuffs tight, ignoring the man's calm warning. "You really don't want to do this." Bennett thought he was the king of his courtroom. He had no idea he was arresting the very man sent to decide his fate. This isn't just a story about a mistake. It's a story about the most satisfying karma you will ever witness. The air in the King County District Courthouse, specifically Department 4, always smelled the same. A depressing cocktail of floor wax, stale, nervous sweat, and overbrewed coffee that had been burning on the hot plate since 6 a.m. They called this courtroom the Grinder. It was where the city chewed up the petty offenders, the traffic violators, and the disorderly conducts, spitting them out with fines or time served before lunch. It was 8:45 a.m. on a Tuesday. The gallery was already packed shoulder to shoulder. Mothers shushed crying babies, men in work boots checked their watches anxiously, and public defenders ran back and forth like headless chickens, clutching stacks of manila folders that were slipping from their grip. At the center of this chaotic orbit stood Deputy Carter Bennett. Bennett was a large man, the kind who spent too much time on his biceps and not enough on his cardio. He wore his beige uniform like a suit of armor, his thumb always hooked casually, yet threateningly, near his belt. He wasn't just the bailiff here. In the absence of the judge, he acted like the landlord. He had been working the Grinder for 6 years, and the power had seeped into his bones like rot. He knew the regulars. He knew the attorneys who would fold, and he knew exactly how to make a defendant feel small. "Quiet down," Bennett bellowed, his voice bouncing off the cheap wood paneling. The room fell silent instantly. "If I hear one more cell phone ping, I'm confiscating it and auctioning it off for the police charity ball. Sit up straight. This is a court of law, not your living room." He smirked as a young teenager in the back row hastily shoved a phone into his pocket. Bennett loved that. The flinch. It fed him. Down by the defense table, the chaos was more organized. Emily Chen, a public defender who looked like she hadn't slept since law school, was frantically flipping through a docket. "Mrs. Higgins," Emily whispered to the court clerk, a formidable woman with grey steel wool hair and glasses on a chain. "Where is Judge Abernathy? We have 40 cases on the morning calendar. If we don't start in 10 minutes, I'm going to have a riot on my hands." Mrs. Higgins didn't look up from her computer. "Abernathy called in with the flu. We have a visiting justice coming in from the State Superior Court. Some big shot. He's supposed to be here any minute." Bennett, overhearing this, snorted. "Visiting justice? Great. That means he's going to be slow. He's going to want to read every single file. We're going to be here until midnight." He shook his head, walking toward the water cooler near the side door. "I better handle the crowd before this 'Your Honor' shows up and confuses everyone." That was when the side door, the one usually reserved for court staff and attorneys, clicked open. A man stepped in. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out a charcoal grey, bespoke 3-piece suit. His skin was a deep, rich mahogany, and his hair was cut in a precise fade, greying slightly at the temples. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Bennett's car. He didn't look confused. He didn't look scared. He looked around the room with an air of calm, analytical detachment, checking the layout, the flag, the clerk's desk. He walked past the bar, the wooden railing separating the public from the court personnel, with a fluid, confident stride. He placed his briefcase on the empty prosecution table and began to unclasp it. Bennett froze mid-sip of his water. His eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize this man. He wasn't one of the regular DAs. He wasn't one of the private defense sharks who came slumming it in the grinder. To Bennett's biased eyes, he saw only one thing: an arrogant defendant who thought a fancy suit gave him the right to walk wherever he pleased. Bennett crushed his paper cup and tossed it into the trash. He strode across the room, his boots thudding heavily on the linoleum. "Hey," Bennett barked. The man in the suit paused, his hand on a leather folio. He turned slowly, his expression mild. "Yes? Who do you think you are?" Bennett stopped 3 feet away, invading the man's personal space. "Get your hands off that table. Step back behind the rail. Now!" The courtroom went dead silent. Emily Chen looked up, confused. Mrs. Higgins stopped typing. The man blinked, a flicker of amusement dancing in his dark eyes. "I believe there is a misunderstanding, Deputy." He glanced at Bennett's nameplate. "Deputy Bennett, I am here for the 9:00 a.m. docket." "I don't care if you're here for the second coming," Bennett sneered, his hand dropping to rest on his baton. "Defendants sit in the gallery until their name is called. You don't just waltz in here, playing dress-up, and set up shop at the attorney's table. You think because you bought a suit at a thrift store you own the place?" A few people in the gallery giggled nervously. Bennett played to the crowd, turning his head slightly to acknowledge the laughter. The man stood fully upright. He was an inch taller than Bennett. "Dress up?" he repeated, his voice a low, rumbling baritone. It was a voice used to commanding vast, silent rooms. "Deputy, I am not a defendant. I don't want to hear your life story, slick." Bennett cut him off, poking a finger toward the man's chest. "I said move, behind the rail. Sit with the other criminals. Don't make me tell you a third time." The man looked down at Bennett's finger, then back up at his face. The amusement was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp steel. "I suggest you lower your voice and remove your finger from my face," the man said softly. "You are making a grave error in judgment." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Usually, when Bennett barked, people jumped. They apologized. They cowered. They didn't stand there and lecture him on judgment. Bennett's face turned a blotchy shade of red. His authority was being challenged in front of his audience, in front of the attorneys, in front of the clerk. "Is that a threat?" Bennett asked loudly, his voice raising an octave. "Did you just threaten an officer of the court?" "It was a caution," the man replied calmly. "Not a threat. That's it." Bennett unclipped the radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Bennett in Dept 4. I've got a disruptive individual refusing lawful orders inside the well." Emily Chen stood up, waving her hands. "Deputy Bennett, wait. Maybe we should just ask him who—" "Stay out of this, Chen," Bennett snapped at her. "I know how to handle these guys. They come in here with their sovereign citizen crap or thinking they can talk their way out of a DUI. He turned back to the man. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The man didn't move. He sighed, a long, weary exhalation. "Deputy, my name is Reginald Hayes. If you would simply ask the clerk—" "I don't care if your name is Barack Obama," Bennett laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it roughly. "You're resisting, that's another charge. Keep talking, buddy. You're digging a hole so deep you won't see sunlight for a month." Reginald Hayes did not resist. He allowed his arm to be twisted, but his body remained rigid, his dignity untouched. "I am not resisting, but I am informing you for the record that you are violating protocol and assaulting a member of the judiciary." Bennett laughed harder. He actually slapped his thigh with his free hand. "A member of the judiciary. Did you hear that, folks?" He looked out at the stunned gallery. "We got a comedian. He thinks he's a judge. Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England." He shoved Hayes toward the defense table, forcing him to bend over. He pulled his handcuffs from his belt. The metallic rasp click of the cuffs echoed through the silent room. "You have the right to remain silent," Bennett recited with mocking glee, tightening the cuffs tighter than necessary on Hayes's wrists. "I suggest you use it. You're going into the holding cell until the real judge gets here. Then we'll see how funny you are." Mrs. Higgins, the clerk, finally stood up. She had been searching for something in her papers, and now she looked pale. "Deputy Bennett," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Deputy, stop. I can't find the docket for a Reginald Hayes as a defendant." "That's because he probably gave a fake name," Bennett said, hauling Hayes upright. He gripped Hayes by the back of his expensive suit jacket. "Don't worry, Mrs. H. We'll run his prints. We'll find out who he really is. Probably got a warrant 3 states over." Hayes looked at Mrs. Higgins. He didn't look at Bennett. "Madam Clerk?" Hayes said, his voice perfectly even, despite being manhandled. "Please check the transfer orders from the State Supreme Court. Look for Justice Reginald Hayes." Bennett froze for a split second. The word justice hung in the air. Not judge, justice. That was a higher tier, but Bennett was too far gone. His ego wouldn't let him back down now. He shoved Hayes forward. "Nice try. Justice. You guys come up with everything. Let's go." He began to frog march the man toward the heavy steel door that led to the holding cells, the tank where the in-custody defendants waited. "Emily," Hayes called out, looking at the public defender. He had read her name tag earlier. Emily jumped. "Yes? Please ensure the court record reflects that at 8:55 a.m., Deputy Bennett placed me under arrest without cause, refused to verify my credentials, and used excessive force during the detainment." "Shut up!" Bennett shoved him through the door. "Stop acting like a lawyer." Bennett slammed the heavy steel door shut and locked it. He turned back to the courtroom, dusting his hands off as if he had just taken out the trash. He was beaming. "Now that," Bennett announced to the stunned room, "is how you maintain order. Let that be a lesson. I don't care how nice your suit is, you respect the badge." He walked back to his desk, feeling 10 feet tall. "Mrs. Higgins," Bennett said, leaning back in his chair, "call the sheriff's office. Tell them I need a transport for a disorderly, and see if the actual visiting judge is lost in the parking lot. We need to get this show on the road." Mrs. Higgins was staring at her computer screen. Her mouth was slightly open. Her face had gone from pale to a terrified shade of grey. "Deputy," she whispered. "What?" Bennett grabbed his water again. "I found the email," she said. Her voice cracked. "It went to my spam folder. It's from the State Judicial Oversight Committee." Bennett rolled his eyes. "And?" Mrs. Higgins turned the monitor slowly so Bennett could see it. On the screen was a high-resolution photo of the man Bennett had just thrown into a cell. Below the photo, the text read, "Honorable Justice Reginald A. Hayes, Circuit Chief of the State Appeals Court, designated oversight official for King County District." Bennett stared at the screen. The water cup slipped from his hand. It hit the floor with a wet splat, spilling water all over his polished boots. He didn't even feel it. He's the judge?" Bennett squeaked. "He's not just the judge," Emily Chen said from her table, looking at her phone where she had just Googled the name. She looked up at Bennett with a mix of horror and pity. "Carter, that man is the Chief of Appeals. He's known as the Hammer in the higher courts. He literally wrote the handbook on police misconduct last year." Bennett felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and dizzy. The silence in the courtroom wasn't fearful anymore. It was the silence of a bomb that had just been armed, the timer ticking down to 0. And the man holding the detonator was currently sitting in a holding cell wearing Bennett's handcuffs. The silence in courtroom 4 was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum. It was the sort of silence that precedes a tsunami, where the water recedes from the shore, leaving the fish flapping helplessly on the sand before the inevitable crash. Deputy Carter Bennett stared at the computer monitor, his eyes tracing the letters of Justice Reginald A. Hayes over and over again, as if hoping the pixels would rearrange themselves into the name of a wanted felon. They didn't. The face on the screen, distinguished, intelligent, commanding, was undeniably the face of the man he had just shoved into a concrete box next to a meth addict and a shoplifter. Bennett's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. A cold sweat broke out instantly across his forehead, prickling at his hairline. His stomach dropped, a sickening sensation of vertigo that made the room spin. "Think, Carter. Think," he screamed internally. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's a brother? A look-alike? Stolen ID? "Deputy," Mrs. Higgins hissed, her voice cutting through his panic. "You have to let him out. Right now." Bennett looked at her, his eyes wide and glassy. "If I let him out, if he really is a justice, my career is over. He'll have my badge. He'll have my pension." "If you keep him in there," Emily Chen interjected from the defense table, her voice low and urgent, "you're looking at kidnapping charges, false imprisonment, assault on a judicial officer. Carter, this isn't a traffic ticket mix-up. This is a felony." Bennett took a step towards the holding cell door, his hand shaking as he reached for his keys. But before his fingers could graze the metal, the phone on the clerk's desk rang. It wasn't the soft, polite chirping of the internal line. It was the jarring, red-light blare of the emergency priority line, the direct link to headquarters. Brrring, brrring. Bennett froze. Every eye in the courtroom turned to the red phone. It looked like a bomb about to detonate. Mrs. Higgins reached for it, but Bennett slammed his hand down on the receiver, stopping her. "I'll get it," he choked out. He needed to control the narrative. He needed a second to breathe. He picked up the handset, his palm slippery with sweat. "Department 4, Deputy Bennett." "Bennett!" The voice on the other end was like gravel inside a cement mixer. It was Sheriff Lucas Miller. The man was a legend in the county, hard as nails by the book, and possessing a temper that could peel paint off the walls. "Sheriff," Bennett squeaked. He cleared his throat, trying to drop his voice to its usual bravado. "Sheriff, good morning." "Cut the pleasantries," Miller barked. "I've got the State Attorney General's office on the other line. They're tracking Justice Hayes's secure phone. The GPS says he's in your courtroom, but his security detail says he's not answering check-ins. He's been dark for 15 minutes. Bennett's knees knocked together. He looked at the heavy steel door of the holding cell. The GPS. Of course, a state Supreme Court justice would have a secure device. He is here, Sheriff," Bennett lied, the words tasting like ash. "He's just getting settled, in chambers. The reception is bad back there. Thick walls." "Put him on," Miller demanded. "The AG is freaking out. They think he's been targeted. Hayes is presiding over that massive corruption appeal next week. They're worried someone got to him." Bennett felt the blood drain out of his extremities. I can't right now, sir. He's roping up, putting on the robe. You know how judges are." He said no interruptions. There was a pause on the line, a silence that felt heavier than the one in the courtroom. "Bennett," Sheriff Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet growl. "You sound weird. Is everything 10-4 down there? Do you have the situation under control?" "Yes, sir," Bennett said, too loudly. 100%. Just waiting for His Honor to take the bench." "Fine. Tell him to call his detail the second he steps out. If I don't hear from him in 5 minutes, I'm sending the SWAT team to sweep the building. We aren't taking risks with estate justice." Click. Bennett hung up the phone. He stared at the receiver for a second, realizing what he had just done. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had now lied to the sheriff and the attorney general to cover up a felony. He had turned a career-ending blunder into a potential prison sentence. He looked up. The courtroom was watching. The gallery, usually a sea of bored faces, was now electric with anticipation. Phones were out. People were recording. They knew something was wrong. They could smell the fear coming off the deputy in waves. Emily Chen stood up slowly. "Carter," she said softly, "did you just tell the sheriff that the man you have handcuffed in the tank is robbing up?" Bennett didn't answer. He couldn't. He felt like a man standing on train tracks, watching the locomotive headlights swell in the distance. He turned toward the steel door. He had 5 minutes. 5 minutes to fix the unfixable. 5 minutes to convince a man who can rewrite laws that being treated like a criminal was just a hilarious, practical joke. Bennett walked toward the cell door, his boots feeling like they were filled with lead. He fumbled for his key ring. His hands shook so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the key into the lock. Clack. The tumbler turned. Bennett took a deep breath, pasted a sickly, terrified smile on his face, and pushed the door open. The holding cell, or the tank, was a bleak concrete box designed to drain the hope out of anyone who entered it. It smelled of industrial disinfectant and human misery. There was a stainless steel toilet in the corner and a narrow wooden bench bolted to the wall. Usually, when Bennett opened this door, he was met with cursing, crying, or someone sleeping off a hangover. Today, he was met with absolute stillness. Justice Reginald Hayes was sitting on the wooden bench. His posture was impeccable. He hadn't loosened his tie. He hadn't slumped against the dirty wall. He sat with his legs crossed at the ankles, his back straight, looking for all the world like he was sitting in a leather chair at a country club, despite the handcuffs binding his wrists behind his back. He looked up as the light from the hallway spilled in. His expression was unreadable. It wasn't angry. It wasn't scared. It was the look of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating, yet repulsive, insect. "Well," Hayes said. His voice echoed slightly in the small space. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Deputy? Is it time for my transfer to the county jail? Or have you decided to run my prints, as you promised?" Bennett stepped inside, letting the door close partially behind him to block the view from the gallery. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry, wheezing cough. "Hey, listen, buddy. Sir. Your Honor," Bennett stammered, wringing his hands. We got the paperwork sorted. Computer glitch. You know how it is. Technology, right?" Hayes didn't blink. "A computer glitch caused you to twist my arm, handcuff me, and ignore my identification?" "Look, I was just doing my job," Bennett pleaded, his voice taking on a whining tone. "We get a lot of crazies in here. I have to be careful. Officer safety. Surely you understand that. I didn't know who you were." "You didn't know who I was," Hayes repeated slowly. "And that is the problem, Deputy Bennett. You treated me that way because you didn't know who I was, which implies that if I were merely Reginald Hayes, a citizen, and not Justice Hayes, a judge, that treatment would have been acceptable in your eyes." Bennett froze. The man was dissecting him. I'm just saying, I'm willing to let bygones be bygones," Bennett said, reaching for his handcuff key. "I'm going to take these off you. We get you some water. Maybe get your suit brushed off, and we can start the docket. The sheriff is asking for you. We don't want to make a scene, right?" Bennett stepped around to unlock the cuffs. "Stop," Hayes commanded. Bennett flinched. Sir, do not touch me yet. Hayes stood up. He turned his back to Bennett. Unlock them, but do not think for 1 second that this removes the stain of what you have done. Bennett's hands trembled as he unlocked the cuffs. Click, click. Hayes brought his hands forward. He rubbed his wrists. There were deep, angry red indentations where the metal had dug into his dark skin. Bennett had applied them on the tightest setting, a petty, spiteful move he did to people he didn't like. Hayes looked at the marks. Then he looked at Bennett. You squeezed them tight, Hayes noted softly, to cause pain, to assert dominance. It was an accident. Bennett lied again. I have a photographic memory, Deputy, Hayes said. I recall the exact motion of your wrist. It was no accident. Hayes picked up his briefcase from where Bennett had tossed it on the floor. He dusted it off with a slow, deliberate motion. Then he adjusted his cuffs, straightened his tie, and buttoned his jacket. Shall we? Hayes gestured to the door. Yeah, sure. Right this way, Your Honor. Bennett rushed to open the door, acting like a subservient valet. They stepped back out into the courtroom. The reaction was instantaneous. The gallery went silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of awe. Reginald Hayes didn't walk like a victim. He walked like a king returning to his throne. He strode past the defense table, nodding once to Emily Chen. He walked past the prosecutor's table. He walked past the terrified Mrs. Higgins. He didn't stop at the attorneys' tables. He continued walking up the 3 steps to the raised platform where the judge's bench sat. Bennett stood by the holding cell door, looking small and sweaty. He watched as the man he had ridiculed ascended the steps. Hayes reached the high-backed leather chair. He stood in front of it for a moment, looking out over the courtroom, over the lawyers, the gallery, and finally, resting his gaze on Deputy Bennett. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek, black robe. He put it on, sliding his arms into the sleeves with practiced grace. He zipped it up. The transformation was complete. He was no longer just a man in a suit. He was the personification of the state's power. He sat down. The chair creaked. Hayes reached out and picked up the heavy wooden gavel. He turned it over in his hand, inspecting it. Then, bang! The sound cracked like a gunshot, making everyone jump, especially Bennett. Department 4 is now in session, Justice Hayes announced, his voice booming without the need for a microphone. I am Justice Reginald Hayes presiding. He paused, letting the weight of his title sink in. Deputy Bennett, Hayes said, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. Bennett shuffled forward, looking like he wanted to vomit. Yes, Your Honor. Please approach the bench. Bennett walked to the center of the room. He felt naked. Every eye was on him. The camera phones in the back were held high. Usually, Hayes began, his tone conversational but deadly, the bailiff announces the judge. But since you were indisposed trying to incarcerate me, I had to announce myself. We will let that slide for the moment. Hayes opened a file on the desk, the docket Mrs. Higgins had silently slid toward him. However, Hayes continued, before we hear the first case, we have a procedural matter to discuss. Deputy, you arrested a man in this courtroom approximately 20 minutes ago. You charged him with, what was it? Disrupting the peace? Resisting arrest? I, Bennett stammered. I dropped the charges, Your Honor. Oh, you dropped them. Hayes raised an eyebrow. How generous of you. But the record, Deputy, is the record. You detained a citizen. You handcuffed him. You placed him in a cell. Tell me, Deputy, based on your extensive knowledge of the law which you were so eager to lecture me on, what is the probable cause for arresting a man for standing quietly at a table? Bennett looked around for help. There was none. The prosecutor was staring at his shoes. Emily Chen was scribbling furiously on a notepad. I thought he was a defendant acting out, Bennett whispered. Because he was black? The question hung in the air. It wasn't shouted. It was stated as a simple hypothesis. No, sir, absolutely not, Bennett protested, sweating profusely. I treat everyone the same. Do you? Hayes leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. Mrs. Higgins, please play back the audio recording from the courtroom security system for the last 20 minutes. I believe this courtroom is equipped with always-on audio for safety. Is it not? Mrs. Higgins nodded frantically. Yes, Your Honor. Play it. Specifically, the part where the deputy told the individual he was playing dress up, and that he didn't care if his name was Barack Obama. Bennett felt his soul leave his body. He watched Mrs. Higgins click the mouse. A moment later, Bennett's own voice boomed through the speakers, tinny but unmistakable. You think because you bought a suit at a thrift store you own the place? I don't care if your name is Barack Obama. Get in the cell. He thinks he's a judge. Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England. The laughter from the recording echoed in the silent room, mocking the current reality. Hayes signaled for the audio to stop. He looked down at Bennett, whose face was now a deep, beet red. The Queen of England, Hayes mused. An interesting choice of title, Deputy. But here is the reality. You didn't just insult me. You violated the Fourth Amendment rights of a citizen. You profiled. You escalated without cause. And then, Hayes's eyes hardened. And then, when your clerk informed you of your mistake, you did not immediately release me. You debated it. You worried about your pension. And when the sheriff called, you lied. Bennett's head snapped up. How did you? The holding cell, Deputy, Hayes said coldly. The vent connects directly to the Clark station. Acoustics are a fascinating thing. I heard every word you said to Sheriff Miller. Hayes picked up the phone on his desk, the same red phone Bennett had slammed down earlier. Dispatch? Hayes spoke into the receiver, his eyes locked on Bennett. This is Justice Hayes in Department 4. Please connect me to Sheriff Miller immediately. Tell him I am safe, but I require a team of internal affairs officers at my courtroom. Immediately. He hung up the phone. Deputy Bennett, Hayes said, his voice final. You are relieved of duty. Please place your badge and your firearm on the table, and then you will take a seat in the gallery. You are no longer the bailiff in this courtroom. Today, you are a witness to your own demise. Bennett stood there, shaking. Slowly, painfully, he unclipped his gun belt. The heavy thud of the weapon hitting the table sounded like a coffin lid closing. He unpinned his badge, the badge he had hidden behind for 6 years, and laid it next to the gun. Sit down, Hayes commanded. Bennett walked to the front row of the gallery and sat down, burying his face in his hands. Hayes adjusted his glasses. He looked out at the stunned crowd. Now, Hayes said, his voice calm and professional, as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. Let us call the first case, State of Washington versus Michael Henderson. The grinder was back in business, but the gears had shifted, and Deputy Carter Bennett was about to find out just how fine they ground. For the next 2 hours, the courtroom known as the grinder underwent a metamorphosis that was nothing short of miraculous. Usually, under the reign of Deputy Bennett and the previous apathetic judges, the morning docket was a slaughterhouse. Defendants were processed like livestock, names called, fines levied, jail time assigned, next. There was no listening, only processing. But Justice Reginald Hayes was not processing. He was adjudicating. Carter Bennett sat in the front row of the gallery, the wood of the bench digging into his spine, He was surrounded by the very people he had terrorized for years. To his left was a mother he had shushed earlier. She was now looking at him with a mix of curiosity and vindication. To his right was the teenager whose phone he had threatened to confiscate. The kid was texting furiously, likely broadcasting Bennett's downfall to the entire high school district. Bennett wanted to leave. He wanted to run out the back door, get in his truck, and drive until he hit the state line. But he couldn't. He was under a direct judicial order to sit and watch. It was a unique form of torture. He had to watch a master class in the very job he had failed at so miserably, upholding the law. "State versus Michael Henderson," Justice Hayes called out. A young man, barely 18, stood up. He was trembling. He wore a baggy hoodie and jeans. This was the kid Bennett had laughed at earlier for looking scruffy. Emily Chen stepped forward. "Your Honor, Michael is charged with loitering and failure to disperse. He was standing outside a convenience store waiting for a ride. Under the old regime, Bennett would have already been standing behind the kid, hand on his baton, intimidating him into a guilty plea just to get it over with." Hayes looked at the paperwork, then at the young man. "Mr. Henderson, why were you at the store?" I work there, sir," the boy stammered. "I mean, Your Honor, my shift ended. My mum was late picking me up because her car broke down. The officer said I was loitering." Hayes looked at the police report. "The report says you gave the officer attitude." "I just told him I worked there," Michael whispered. Hayes took off his glasses. He looked at the prosecutor. "Counselor, do we have a statement from the store owner?" No, Your Honor," the prosecutor admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "Just the arresting officer's word." Hayes turned his gaze toward the gallery, specifically at Bennett. "The officer's word," Hayes repeated. "We place a great deal of trust in the word of an officer. We assume that the badge confers honesty. We assume that a man in uniform has no bias, no bad days, no ego." He let the silence stretch. Bennett shrank lower in his seat. "But," Hayes continued, "as we have seen today, a badge does not make a man righteous. It only makes him powerful, and power without character is a danger to the public." Hayes looked back at Michael. "Mr. Henderson, case dismissed with prejudice, and I apologize that you were arrested for waiting for your mother. You are free to go." The boy looked stunned. "Really? Really? Go to school." The gallery erupted in whispers. This never happened. The grinder didn't dismiss cases, it crushed them. As the morning went on, Bennett watched case after case being handled with fairness, dignity, and terrifying intelligence. Hayes knew the case law better than the attorneys. He spotted errors in police reports that no one else saw. He was efficient, but he was human. Bennett realized with a sinking horror that this was what the job was supposed to be. And by comparison, Bennett's entire career looked like a cruel joke. Then, the back doors of the courtroom swung open with a force that rattled the frames. The room went silent. Sheriff Lucas Miller strode in. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were two officers from the Internal Affairs Bureau, IAB, identifiable by their plain clothes and grim expressions. Behind them were two uniformed deputies, Bennett's own colleagues. Miller was a man of few words, and right now his face was a mask of controlled fury. He walked past the gallery, past Bennett, who instinctively tried to stand up, then sat back down when Miller didn't even look at him, and approached the bench. "Justice Hayes," Miller said, his voice tight. "I am relieved to see you are unharmed, sir." "Physically I am fine, Sheriff," Hayes said, closing a file. "Mentally, I am concerned about the state of your department." "Understood, sir," Miller said. He finally turned slowly to face the gallery. His eyes locked onto Bennett. "Bennett!" Miller barked. Bennett stood up, his legs shaking so bad he had to grab the bench in front of him. "Sheriff, I can explain. It was a misunderstanding. He didn't have ID." "Save it for the interview," Miller cut him off. He nodded to the IAB officers. The two plainclothes officers walked up the aisle. They didn't hustle. They moved with the inevitable slowness of a funeral procession. They stopped on either side of Bennett. "Carter Bennett," one of the officers said, a man Bennett recognized as Sergeant Kowalski, a guy known for eating dirty cops for breakfast. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Bennett looked at the uniformed deputies behind them, guys he had grabbed beers with last Friday. "Guys? Really? Tom? Mike?" Tom looked at the ceiling. Mike looked at the floor. The blue wall of silence had crumbled. Bennett was radioactive. "Do it, Bennett," Sheriff Miller ordered. "Don't make us add resisting to the list." Bennett turned around. He felt the cold steel of handcuffs on his wrists for the second time that day. But this time, he wasn't the one holding the key. "You are being detained pending an investigation into unlawful arrest, official misconduct, and filing a false report," Kowalski recited. As they marched Bennett out of the courtroom, he had to walk past the defense table. He looked at Emily Chen, looking for sympathy. She just shook her head, sad and disappointed. He looked up at the bench. Justice Hayes wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was watching with a solemn intensity. "Sheriff Miller," Hayes called out before they reached the door. "Sir?" "Please ensure Mr. Bennett is processed according to the book," Hayes said. "No tight cuffs, no rough rides, no accidental tripping. We will afford him the exact due process he tried to deny me." "Yes, Your Honor," Miller said. The doors closed behind them, sealing Bennett's fate. 3 days later, the atmosphere in the disciplinary hearing room at headquarters was sterile and cold. It wasn't a courtroom. It was a small conference room with no windows, a long table, and a video camera on a tripod pointing at a single chair. Carter Bennett sat in that chair. He was no longer in uniform. He wore an ill-fitting suit he hadn't worn since his brother's wedding. He looked smaller, deflated. The arrogance that had fueled him in Department 4 had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man. Across from him sat Sheriff Miller, a representative from the police union named Dave Bates, and, to everyone's surprise, Justice Reginald Hayes. Hayes wasn't wearing his robe. He was in his bespoke suit, hands folded on a thick stack of files. "This is an administrative hearing regarding the employment status of Deputy Carter Bennett," Sheriff Miller began for the record. "Present is Union Rep Bates. Also present at the request of the Oversight Committee is Justice Hayes." Bennett's union rep, Bates, leaned forward. "Look, Sheriff, Carter knows he screwed up. He didn't ID the judge. It was a mistake. But let's not blow this out of proportion. We're willing to accept a suspension. 2 weeks without pay. Apology letter. But firing him. Criminal charges. That's excessive for a bad judgment call." Sheriff Miller looked at Hayes. "Justice." Hayes opened the file in front of him. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table toward Bennett. "Mr. Bennett," Hayes said calmly, "do you know why I was in Department 4 on Tuesday?" Bennett cleared his throat. "Because Judge Abernathy had the flu. You were filling in." Hayes allowed a small, dry smile to touch his lips. "That is what the clerk believed. That is what you believed. But that is not the truth." Bennett frowned. "What?" "Judge Abernathy does not have the flu," Hayes revealed. "Judge Abernathy has been on administrative leave for 2 weeks, pending an investigation into case mismanagement. And I was not there to substitute." Hayes leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Bennett's. "I was there for you." The room went deadly silent. Even the union rep looked confused. "For me," Bennett whispered. "We have received 27 formal complaints about you in the last 18 months, Mr. Bennett," Hayes said. "Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation of defense attorneys, misplacing paperwork for defendants you didn't like." "Those were all unsubstantiated," Bennett protested. "IA cleared me." "IA cleared you because there was never any video evidence," Hayes countered. "Every time a complaint was filed, your body camera mysteriously malfunctioned. Corrupted files, dead batteries, user error. An incredible string of bad luck with technology." Hayes tapped the file. "The State Oversight Committee decided we needed a first-hand look. We call it a stress audit. We send someone in, unannounced, undercover, or low profile, to see how the officer behaves when he thinks no one important is watching." Bennett's mouth fell open. "It was a sting? You set me up?" "I didn't set you up," Hayes corrected him sharply. "I simply walked into a room. You did the rest. I gave you every opportunity to act like a professional. I identified myself. I remained calm. I asked you to check the record. You chose to escalate. You chose to mock. You chose to violate the law." "But the camera," Bennett stammered. "The courtroom camera audio. You played that." "Yes," Hayes said. "But that's not the evidence that worries you, is it?" Hayes pulled a USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. "You see, Deputy, when I came into the courtroom, I wasn't just carrying a briefcase. My briefcase is equipped with a continuously recording high-definition camera and microphone installed by the FBI's Public Corruption Unit." Bennett's face turned grey. "We have everything," Hayes continued. "But we also have something else. When we seized your phone, the personal one you used to text your wife after you arrested me, our tech team did a forensic recovery." Hayes flipped a page in the file. "It seems you have a group chat with 3 other deputies. A chat named The Cleaners." The union rep, Bates, suddenly closed his folder. He physically pulled his chair an inch away from Bennett. Bates knew a sinking ship when he saw one. "In this chat," Hayes read, "you discuss how to tweak the body cams. You brag about teaching lessons to defendants. And specifically, at 9:02 a.m. on Tuesday, you sent a message. Just bagged a sovereign citizen nut job in a fancy suit. Gonna let him rot in the tank for an hour before I book him. LOL." Hayes looked up. "That LOL is going to be very expensive for you, Mr. Bennett." Sheriff Miller spoke up, his voice disgusted. "Bennett, based on the evidence collected by Justice Hayes and the subsequent forensic audit of your devices, we are moving past termination." Miller slid a paper across the table. It wasn't a suspension notice. It was a warrant. "The district attorney is filing charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and perjury for the lie you told me on the phone." Bennett looked at the union rep. "Dave, do something." Dave Bates shook his head. "I can't defend this, Carter. This isn't a job action. This is criminal conspiracy. You're on your own." Bennett looked back at Hayes. Tears were welling up in his eyes now. Tears of self-pity. "Please," Bennett whispered. "I have a family. I have a mortgage. I didn't know it was you. If I knew it was a judge, I never would have—" "And that," Hayes interrupted, his voice booming with the finality of a gavel strike, "is exactly why you are going to prison." Hayes stood up. "You are pleading for mercy because of my status," Hayes said, looking down at the broken man. "But justice does not care about status. You should have treated the man in the suit with the same respect you would treat the sheriff. You failed the most basic test of humanity. You thought you were the predator, deputy. but you forgot that in the jungle of the law, there is always a bigger lion. Hayes nodded to the sheriff. He's all yours, Lucas. Sheriff Miller gestured to the door. Get him out of here. As Bennett was led out of the conference room, stripped of his suit jacket, his tie, and his dignity, he realized the true horror of his situation. He wasn't just losing his job. He was going to become a defendant in the very system he had abused. And in the grinder, the gears were waiting for him. The trial of Carter Bennett did not take place in Courtroom 4. It was moved to the Superior Court, 3 counties over, to ensure an unbiased jury. But the distance didn't save him. The evidence was overwhelming. The video from Justice Hayes's briefcase was played on national news. The text messages from the Cleaners group chat became the subject of late-night talk show monologues. Bennett sat at the defendant's table, looking small and pale. He wore a cheap suit that hung loosely on his frame, having lost 30 pounds from stress. When he looked at the jury, he didn't see sympathy. He saw the faces of the people he had bullied for years. He saw the scruffy kids, the tired mothers, the people he had dismissed as trash. The prosecution didn't need to do much. Justice Hayes took the stand as the star witness. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply recounted the events with the surgical precision of a man who had spent his life dissecting the truth. Mr. Bennett didn't see a citizen, Hayes told the jury. He saw an opportunity to exercise dominance. He believed his badge gave him the right to be a tyrant. He was wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Bennett didn't cry. He just stared at the table, realizing the ultimate irony. He was going to prison not because he had arrested a man, but because he had underestimated one. The sentencing was swift. 5 years in federal prison for civil rights violations. 6 months later, former Deputy Carter Bennett was working in the prison laundry. It was hot, humid, and smelled of bleach, not unlike the grinder. "Hey, new guy!" a voice barked. Bennett turned. A large inmate, covered in tattoos, was standing there holding a laundry bag. Bennett recognized him. It was a man he had arrested 2 years ago, a man he had mocked for crying about his sick daughter during booking. "You missed a spot," the inmate sneered, tossing the dirty bag at Bennett's feet. "Pick it up, and don't give me any attitude." Bennett bent down to pick up the bag. He kept his head down. He kept his mouth shut. He had learned his lesson. Back in the city, Courtroom 4 was different. The walls were painted a brighter color. The air smelled cleaner. And behind the bench sat a new judge, a young woman who listened more than she spoke. On the wall of the courtroom, a small plaque had been installed. It read, "Justice is not about who you are. It is about what you do. Justice Reginald Hayes." The system wasn't perfect, but the rot had been cut out. And somewhere in the state capital, Justice Hayes was smiling, knowing that sometimes the best way to clean up a mess is to walk right into the middle of it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of how one arrogant deputy learned the hard way that you never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book is the one who wrote the laws you're supposed to enforce. Carter Bennett thought he was untouchable, but he forgot that the higher you climb on a ladder of ego, the harder the fall. Justice Reginald Hayes proved that true power isn't about shouting or intimidation. It's about integrity, patience, and knowing exactly when to drop the hammer. It's a reminder to all of us. Treat everyone with respect, because you never know who you're really talking to. What do you think? Did Bennett get what he deserved, or was 5 years too harsh? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and justice served, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good twist, and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss our next story. Thanks for watching, and remember, be kind or be careful.